Chapter 17. In the late afternoon, crowds of peasants came from the villages. They brought fruits and vegetables in exchange for the rich canned pork sent to the Red Army all the way from America for shoes or for a piece of tent canvas suitable for making into a pair of trousers or a jacket. As the soldiers were finishing their afternoon duties, one heard accordion music and singing here and there. The peasants listened intently to the songs, barely understanding the words. "We are going to fight the bankers, the landlords, and the rest. We'll seal the doom of kulaks, these damned blood-sucking pests. We Red Army soldiers are fighting for the poor, to give the people freedoms and make their lives secure." Some of the peasants joined boldly and loudly in the song. Others appeared alarmed, suspiciously watching the faces of their neighbors who displayed such sudden and unexpected affection for the Red Army. Women came from the villages in increased numbers, together with their men. Some of them flirted openly with the soldiers, trying to lure them in the direction of their husbands or brothers who were trading a few steps away. Ashen-haired and light eyes, they pulled down their ragged blouses and hiked up their worn skirts with a casual air, swinging their hips as they strolled around. The soldiers came closer, bringing from their tents bright cans of American pork and beef, packets of tobacco, and paper for rolling cigarettes. Disregarding the presence of the men, they looked deep into the woman's eyes, accidentally brushing against their bosom, bodies, and breathing in their odor. Soldiers occasionally sneaked out of the camp and visited the villages to continue trade with the farmers and meet village girls. The command of the regiment did its best to prevent such planned secret contacts with the population. The political officers, the battalion commanders, and even the divisional news sheets warned of soldiers against such individual escapades. They pointed out that some of the wealthier farmers were under the influence of the nationalist partisans who roamed the forest in an attempt to slow down the victorious march of the Soviet army and to prevent the approaching triumph of the government of workers and peasants. They indicated that men from other regiments returned from such excursions severely beaten, and that some had disappeared altogether. One day, however, a few soldiers disregarded the risk of punishment and managed to slip out of the camp. The guards pretended not to notice. Life in the camp was monotonous, and the soldiers, waiting for departure or action, were desperate for some entertainment. Mitka and Kuku knew about the outing of his friends, and he might even have gone with them if he had not been crippled. He often said that since the Red Army soldiers risked their lives for those local people by fighting the fascists, there was no reason to avoid their company. Mitka had been looking after me ever since I entered the regimental hospital. Thanks to his feeding, I gained weight. Mitka fished out the great cauldron of the best pieces of meat and skimmed the fat off the soup for me. He also assisted me in my painful injections, boosting my courage before medical examinations. Once, when I got indigestion from overeating, Mitka sat with me for 2 days, holding my head when I vomited and wiping my face with a wet cloth. While Gavrila taught me serious things, explaining the role of the party, Mitka introduced me to poetry and sang me songs, strumming an accompaniment on his guitar. It was Mitka who took me to the regimental cinemas and carefully explained the films. I went with him to watch the mechanics repairing the engines of the powerful Z's and Studebaker trucks, and it was Mitka who took me to the sharpshooters in training. Mitka was one of the best linked and respected men in the regiment. He had fine military record. On special army days, one could see decorations on his faded uniform, which would be the envy of regimental or even divisional commanders. Mitka was a hero of the Soviet Union, the highest military honor, and one of the most decorated men in the whole division. He was also a party candidate. His feats as a sharpshooter were described in newspapers and books for children and adults. He was featured several times in newsreels seen by millions of Soviet citizens on collective farms and in factories. The regiment took great pride in Mitka. He was photographed for his divisional news sheets and interviewed by correspondents. Soldiers often told tales at the evening campfire about the dangerous missions he had undertaken only a year earlier. They discussed endlessly his heroic actions alone in the rear of the enemy, when he parachuted in and then sniped at officers and couriers of the German army with extraordinary long-range marksmanship. They marveled at the way Mitka managed to return from behind the lines, only to be sent out again on another dangerous mission. During such talks, I swelled with pride. I sat next to Mitka, leaning on his strong arm, listening intently to his voice, so as not to miss a word of what he was saying, or the questions of others. If the war lasted until I was old enough to serve, perhaps I too could become a sharpshooter, a hero, about whom working people talked at their meals. Mitka's rifle was the object of constant admiration. Yielding to request, he would take it out of his sheath, blowing off invisible specks of dust in the sight, and stock. Trembling with curiosity, young soldiers bent over the rifle with the reverence of priests at the altar. Old soldiers with large, horny hands picked up the weapons with its softly polished stock, as a mother picks up a baby from its cradle. Holding their breath, they examined the crystal-clear lens of the telescope sight. It was through this eye that Mitka saw the enemy. These lenses brought the target so close to him that he could see the faces, gestures, smiles. It helped him to aim unerringly at the spot between the metal bars where the German heart was beating. Mitka's face darkened as the soldiers admired his rifle. He instinctively touched the pain-stiffened side of his body, in which the fragments of the German bullet were still embedded. That bullet had ended his career as a sniper a year ago. It tormented him daily. It changed him from Mitka the Cuckoo, as he had been known before, to Mitka the Master, as he was now more often called. He was still the regimental sharpshooting instructor, and he taught young soldiers his art, but that was not what his heart craved. At night I sometimes saw his wide-open, bright, piercing eyes staring at the triangular roof of the tent. He was probably reliving those days and nights when, hidden in branches or in ruins far behind enemy lines, he had waited for the right moment to pick off an officer, a staff messenger, or an airman, or a tank driver. How many times he must have looked the enemy in the face, followed their movements, measured the distance, setting his sights once more. With each one of his well-aimed bullets, he strengthened the Soviet Union by removing one of the enemy's officers. Special German squads with trained dogs had searched for his hiding places, and the manhunts had covered wide circles. How many times he must have thought he would never return. Yet I knew that these must have been the happiest days of Mitka's life. Mitka would not trade these days, when he was both judge and executioner, for any others. Alone, guided by the telescopic sights of his rifle, he deprived the enemy of their choicest men. He recognized them by their decorations, by the insignia of their rank, by the color of their uniforms. Before pulling the trigger, he must have asked himself if this man was worthy of death by a bullet from Mitka the Cuckoo's rifle. Perhaps he should wait for a choicer victim. A captain instead of a lieutenant. A major instead of a captain. A pilot instead of a tank gunner. A staff officer instead of a battalion commander. Every one of his shots could bring death not only to the enemy, but also to himself, thus robbing the Red Army of one of his finest soldiers. Thinking about it, I admired Mitka more and more. Here, laying on bed a few feet from me, was a man who worked for the better and safer world, not by praying at church altars, but by excelling in his aim. The German officer in the magnificent black uniform, who spent his time killing helpless prisoners, or deciding the fate of small black fleas like me, now appeared pitifully insignificant in comparison with Mitka. When the soldiers who had slipped out of the camp to the village did not return, Mitka became worried. The hour of the night inspection was approaching, and their absence might be discovered at any moment. We were sitting in the tent. Mitka paced nervously, rubbing his hands, moist with emotion. There were his closest friends, Grisha, a good singer, whom Mitka accompanied on his accordion, Lonka, who came from the same city, Anton, a poet, who could recite better than anyone else, and Vanka, who Mitka claimed had once saved his life. The sun had set, and the guards had been changed. Mitka kept looking at the phosphorescent dial of his watch, which he had won as a war loot. There was a commotion among the guards outside. Someone shouted for a doctor as a motorcycle spurted at top speed across camp towards headquarters. Mitka rushed out, pulling me along with him. Others also came running behind. Many soldiers were already assembled at the guards' line, surrounding four motionless bodies. Several soldiers covered with blood knelt or stood. We learned from their incoherent words that they had attended a feast at the nearby village and had been attacked by some drunken peasants who had become jealous of their women. The peasants had outnumbered and disarmed them. 4 of the soldiers had been killed with axes and others badly wounded. The deputy commander of the regiment arrived, followed by the other senior officers. The soldiers made their way for them and stood at attention. The wounded men tried in vain to rise. The deputy commander, pale but composed, listened to the report of one of the injured men, and they issued his orders. The wounded were immediately taken to the hospital. Some of them could walk away slowly, supporting one another and wiping blood from their faces and from their hair with their sleeves. Mitka crouched at the feet of the dead man, staring silently at their rigid, butchered faces. Other soldiers stood by, breathing heavily. Vanka lay on his back, his white face turned to the surrounding onlookers. In the dim light of the lantern, one could see streaks of congealed blood on his chest. Lanka's face had been split in two by a terrible blow from an axe. Splintered skull bones were mixed in hanging ribbons of neck muscles. The battered, bloated faces of the other two were barely recognizable. An ambulance drove up. Mitka angrily clutched my arm while the bodies were taken away. The tragedy was brought up in the evening report. The man swallowed hard, listened to new orders, forbidding any contact with the hostile local population, and prohibiting any action which could further aggravate its relations with the army. That night, Mitka kept whispering and muttering to himself, beat his head with his fist, and then sat brooding in silence. Several days passed. Regimental life was returning to normal. The men mentioned the names of the dead less frequently. They began to sing again and prepared for the visit from the field theater. But Mitka was not well, and someone else replaced him in his training duties.